Good day, and welcome to Epstein Becker Green's webinar, Privacy and Security Crash Course, How Do I Execute a Risk Mitigation Plan? Before we begin today's presentation, I would like to remind everyone of the final installment in this series. Please join us on June 30th at 2 p.m. Eastern. You can register for future webinars by visiting www.ebglaw.com/events. Please be informed that today's webinar is being recorded and the participant phone lines will be placed on mute throughout the program. You are welcome to submit questions directly to the presenter following the webinar, and contact information will be displayed at the end of the presentation. In approximately 2 to 3 business days following the webinar, Epstein Becker Green will communicate the availability of the webinar recording and access to the PowerPoint materials. We are pleased to feature a fantastic speaker today. Brandon Gee is an associate in the Healthcare and Life Sciences practice in the firm's Washington, D.C. office. At this time, I'd like to turn the webinar over to Brandon.
All right, thank you, Whitney. So today we'll be talking about risk mitigation and risk management. So hopefully at this point, if you're thinking about risk mitigation, you've already conducted a risk assessment, you've identified your risks, and you've prioritized those risks. So at this point, you really just want to figure out the best way to respond to those risks and reduce them to an acceptable level such that your environment maintains the confidentiality of data and ensures the integrity and availability of data. So there are 4 basic approaches to doing this that we'll discuss in this webinar: risk acceptance, risk avoidance, risk transference, and risk mitigation. But before we begin diving into the approaches, I just want to emphasize the importance of really just getting your entire organization on board. So while historically risk management has been really focused on the IT department, with the development of more sophisticated cyber threats, risk management is becoming more complex and more expensive, and really requires everybody in the organization to be on the same page. So this includes senior executives who will provide the goals and objectives which will guide the overall risk management strategy. This includes your mid-level managers who will plan, execute, and manage your risk management projects. And it includes your people on the ground level who work with the systems on a daily basis and are really going to be instrumental in identifying and responding to your risks. So the first approach to controlling risk is risk acceptance. Now, conceptually, this is rather straightforward. It basically means acknowledging that a risk exists and making a conscious decision to essentially do nothing and accept the consequences. So this may be an appropriate approach when the risk is within the organization's risk tolerance, or it's simply not cost-effective to address the risk. So a classic example of this is if you store your sensitive data in a data center that's located in the Northeast. Conceivably, an earthquake could occur that would destroy your data, but earthquakes in the Northeast are a low enough threat such that it may not be cost-effective for you to earthquake-proof your data center. So before accepting a risk, you should conduct and document a cost-benefit analysis. So you should look at things like the likelihood of risk, the potential loss from the risk, and the cost of implementing controls to mitigate that risk. And then you also want to document your decision to accept the risk. So one of the recurring themes in this webinar is documenting and regularly reviewing your risk management decisions. And especially with risk acceptance, since by definition you're not really doing anything to address the risk, you may be susceptible to changes in the system or the environment. So for example, maybe you decide not to apply certain patches because they're not cost effective. You determine that the security risk just isn't high enough. But maybe a huge vulnerability is discovered that affects unpatched versions of the software. And this may shift the cost-benefit analysis such that it may no longer be prudent to accept the risk. So it's important to continuously track your decisions, and especially your decisions to accept risk. The next approach to controlling risk is risk avoidance, which is basically the opposite of risk acceptance. This is where you take an action to eliminate the risk in one of 2 ways. So the first is by eliminating the source of the risk. So for example, let's say your risk assessment identifies a bunch of vulnerabilities in your wireless network. If your employees generally don't use a wireless network and the network's not critical to your business operations, you might choose to avoid the risk by removing the wireless network altogether. The second way to avoid risk is by eliminating exposure to the risk. So if you have a data center in areas prone to earthquakes, instead of earthquake-proofing your data center, you might choose to avoid the risk by moving your data center somewhere else where earthquakes pose a low threat. So risk avoidance may be appropriate when the risk exceeds the organization's risk tolerance. But as you can imagine, it's often expensive. And one thing that people sometimes overlook is the opportunity cost. So for example, you take down your wireless network, that might have an effect on your employees' productivity. Or to illustrate with a more extreme example, you can try to avoid risk by pulling out of any business that involves sensitive data, but you'd obviously be missing out on the potential gains and business opportunities involved in that line of business. So ultimately, while risk avoidance is often effective at reducing risk, it may not be the most cost-effective way to do so. So the next approach is risk transfer. And this means shifting your responsibility for risk to another party. This is usually done through insurance, such as a policy that covers you in the event of a breach, but it can also be accomplished through indemnification or outsourcing certain functions to third parties. This may be an attractive option when it's difficult to reduce your risk to an acceptable level. However, it generally does not reduce the likelihood of the risk. So for example, just because you have a policy that covers you for the financial losses associated with data breach, if you're not doing anything else to address that risk, you're not really reducing the chance of a breach occurring. And then if a breach occurs, you also have to worry about the secondary effects, such as reputational harm and lost business associated with the data breach. Another downside is that if you're outsourcing certain functions, you lose control over those functions and you develop a bit of a dependency on third parties, which you sometimes want to minimize. So the final approach to responding to risk is risk mitigation. This is where you take an action to reduce the probability or the potential loss associated with the risk. So this involves implementing mitigating controls, which can generally be categorized as preventive or detective. Preventive controls are designed to minimize the impact of a risk. So for example, installing sprinklers is a preventive control because it's intended to minimize damage in the event of a fire. Detective controls, on the other hand, are designed to alert you to errors or irregularities after they've occurred. And these detective controls are important because they provide evidence that your preventive controls are functioning as intended. And so an example of a detective control might be implementing intrusion detection software. Now, as with most risk management, it comes down to a cost-benefit analysis. You have to compare the cost of the mitigating control to the projected benefits. And if the benefits outweigh the costs, then you might want to consider implementing the control. But if the costs outweigh the benefits, then you need to consider other controls or consider a different approach entirely. So to illustrate risk mitigation, let's say you have a data center that's susceptible to flooding because it's on a coastline. You could avoid the risk of flooding by moving the data center inland or to an elevated area or to an area where it doesn't rain so much. But this might be cost prohibitive. So instead you try to make it more flood-proof or mitigate the risk by putting in water pumps, batteries, backup generators, etc. As another example, maybe you're concerned about the loss or theft of employees' mobile devices. So to mitigate this risk, you might choose to employ a mobile device management solution that allows you to remote wipe any lost or stolen devices. Or another way to mitigate the risk is by bolstering your security training to focus more on mobile devices and their security. Or you could prohibit your employees from carrying their mobile devices to high-risk areas. So really, there are often multiple ways to mitigate risks, and each one will have different costs and different benefits. And so you really need to carefully analyze each one. So here are some take-home considerations as you begin to develop and execute your risk mitigation strategies. So first, you really want to develop an overall high-level risk response strategy. And in this strategy, you want to establish your organizational risk tolerance, which can really vary from organization to organization, just based on culture, objectives, and even individuals in control can have different perceptions of security and risk and impact the overall strategy. And in the strategy, you want to outline the overarching goals and objectives, and ultimately the strategy is going to provide the basis for those micro-decisions of whether you're going to accept, avoid, transfer, or mitigate a risk. Next, you want to prioritize. So no organization has unlimited resources. So you really want to focus more resources on addressing higher risks and devote fewer resources to lower risks, or if the risk is low enough, consider accepting them or addressing them later. Next, you want to consider interim measures. Many risk mitigation measures are straightforward, things like installing antivirus or patching software. While others may involve entire shifts in organizational strategy, it can really take a while to implement. And so in these situations, you may want to consider interim measures to reduce risk to an acceptable level pending the completion of these other measures. And then you also want to keep detailed documentation. And so this includes documenting your mitigation strategies. At the outset of this webinar, I mentioned the importance of getting your entire organization on board. And while you want everybody on board, you also want them rowing in the same direction. And so it helps to have a documented high-level strategy that everyone can look to and helps ensure that everyone's on the same page. Lastly, you also want to document all of your analyses and decisions. So I talk about this a little more on the next slide, but you really want to continuously monitor everything you do for risk management. And to do that effectively, you need detailed documentation of everything. And so the last slide I'm going to leave you with is just a reminder that risk management is really an ongoing process. It's not something that you just do once and move on. And you really need to continue to monitor your risk response measures with respect to a variety of things. So this includes compliance, both with organizational mandates, so things like policies and the company's overarching objectives, as well as government mandates, so things like federal and state legislation and regulations. Next, we want to continuously monitor effectiveness. So no one's perfect, and sometimes your risk responses just don't reduce risk as anticipated, or maybe they introduce other risks. So you want to track whether your measures are reducing risk and adjust as appropriate. And lastly, you want to monitor changes, both your systems and your environments. So for example, a change to a system might be an update to an operating system, and this update may introduce a new vulnerability, it may patch an old one, or it may be incompatible with some of your software. And so you really need to stay on top of these things because they may greatly affect your security and your business operations. So changes to environments can be multiple things. One key is monitoring changes in the legal environment. Things like new legislation and new regulations. For example, more states are starting to pass mandated encryption laws. And next, you want to monitor changes to your organizational environment. So things like funding or employee turnover. And finally, you want to monitor changes in the technological environment. So for example, advances in computer technology may necessitate more advanced encryption mechanisms or stronger authentication methods. And so that's all I have for you today. Thank you for listening. I hope this was helpful as you think about your risk mitigation efforts. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me at the email address or the phone number listed in the slide. And now I'll turn it back over to Whitney.
Thank you for joining us. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact today's speaker, Brandon Gee, at bgee@ebglaw.com or via phone. This concludes today's webinar, and approximately 2 to 3 business days following the webinar, Epstein Becker Green will communicate the availability of the webinar recording and access to the PowerPoint materials. Thank you for joining us.